My name isn't important, but the story I'm about to tell is. I'm in my 50s and have been homeless for nearly a decade. Life on the streets isn't easy, but you adapt. Before all this, I was an ordinary worker like anyone else. I had a steady job at an electronics components factory in Seattle, Washington. My job was monotonous but stable, and I took pride in my hard work and dedication. I worked long hours, but always found time for my family, my wife, and my son. Everything changed when the factory closed its doors. The economy was bad, and suddenly, dozens of workers like me were unemployed. At first, I tried everything to find a new job. I sent out resumes, attended interviews, but the responses were always the same. Thank you for your interest, but we found someone more qualified. As the months passed, my savings dried up, and the bills started piling up. My wife, tired of the situation and the stress, decided to leave me, taking our son with her. I was left alone, without a job, and without a family. I ended up on the streets, where life is a constant struggle for survival. The routine is simple, but relentless. I wake up early, long before dawn, to make sure no one steals from me while I sleep. Then I start wandering the city looking for recyclable materials. Cans, bottles, anything that can be sold for some money. If I'm lucky, I can earn enough for a hot meal at one of the community kitchens or even a decent breakfast. At night, I look for a safe place to sleep. It could be under a bridge, in an alley, or, if I'm lucky, in a shelter. The streets of Seattle are harsh, especially during winter when the temperatures drop and the rain is incessant. But you adapt, find ways to survive, and eventually accept your situation. I'm telling this story because something happened recently that deeply disturbed me. I'm not a man easily frightened, but what I saw that night was unlike anything I've ever experienced. The night was especially cold and rainy, and I was looking for materials in a restaurant's dumpster to try and repair my makeshift shelter, which was letting the rainwater in. My clothes were soaked, and I was shivering with cold, but I kept searching because I knew I needed to fix the shelter before the night got worse. That night, I found myself in a neighborhood I usually avoid. The streets were deserted, and the only lighting came from the sparse streetlights and the shop windows of closed stores. Despite the discomfort, the solitude of the deserted streets gave me a strange sense of peace. There was no one around to bother or threaten me. I was lost in my thoughts when I saw something that changed everything. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. In the middle of the street, I saw a figure in the distance, illuminated by the dim light of a street lamp. The person seemed to be walking slowly in a strange way, as if floating. I blinked several times, trying to clear the water from my eyes and focus better. When I managed to see more clearly, I realized the figure looked like a woman, but something was terribly wrong. She didn't seem to have legs. The figure kept moving, but not in a natural way. It seemed to be gliding over the wet ground, and the sight sent a shiver through me. I stood still, trying to understand what I was seeing. After about 30 seconds, she simply vanished. There was nowhere she could have hidden, and the street was empty besides me. This experience left me uneasy. What I saw that night wasn't normal, and to this day, I can't forget the image of that figure. I felt the need to tell someone, to share what I lived through, hoping to find some understanding, or at least relief. Life on the streets is already tough enough without adding disturbing visions to the mix. But something inside me says that what I saw was real. And if it was, what does that mean? I don't usually share my story with anyone. After all, who cares about the life of a homeless person? But recently, I experienced something so disturbing that I felt the need to write and share. Maybe by doing so, I can better understand what happened that night. But first, let me tell you a little about myself. Perhaps someone of goodwill will be moved by the stories that led me to end up on the street and somehow help me get out of it. I am a 45-year-old man, but life on the street has aged me much faster. I was once married, had a stable job, a modest house in the suburbs, and a life that many would consider normal. But the economic crisis, combined with personal and family problems, led me to rock bottom. I lost my job, my house, and eventually, my wife left me. With no one to support me, I ended up on the streets, trying to survive day by day. My daily routine is simple, but exhausting. I wake up early, before dawn, to avoid problems with the authorities or other people in a similar situation to mine. I gather my few belongings, an old blanket, some clothes, and a backpack where I keep what little I have. I spend the day looking for food, whether in shelters, donations, or even in the trash. Hunger is a constant companion, but I've learned to ignore it most of the time. I have some friends on the street, people who, like me, have been abandoned by luck. We form a kind of community where we try to help each other in any way we can. We share food, information about safe places to sleep, and occasionally, even stories to pass the time. But even with this support network, life is lonely and full of dangers. This happened when I was inside my shelter, protecting myself from the rain. The night started like any other. The sound of the rain hitting the makeshift roof of my shelter calmed me a bit, but the water was starting to seep in and needed to be repaired. With a large plastic bag in hand, I went out in search of materials on the streets of Detroit. It was a search I often made, but that night, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something wasn't right. Looking into the dark corners of the city, I avoided certain areas that I knew were dangerous. My route took me to an alley near a restaurant, where I hoped to find something useful. The rain made everything more difficult, but I needed to repair my shelter before it completely collapsed. While rummaging through the trash, something caught my attention. There was a strange noise, something that didn't match the sound of the rain. It sounded like muffled crying, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I decided to ignore it and continued searching. As I searched for my supplies, distracted with my head down, focused on the trash, I heard the sound again, this time clearer. Then, when I lifted my head, I saw something that left me frozen. In the middle of the alley, I saw a silhouette of a person. I paid more attention, and that's when I realized it was a tall man dressed in dark clothes, and he seemed to be holding something. Looking closer, I noticed he was holding a young boy who was clearly in a panic. The man had a cold and determined expression, and before I could react, I heard a dry and frightening sound. It sounded like a gunshot, but with a silencer. The boy fell to the ground. I immediately assumed he must be dead. I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. The killer looked around, and our eyes met for a second. I felt an intense chill, and a wave of panic washed over me. I quickly hid behind a pile of boxes, trying to control my breathing. My mind was in chaos, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The fear of being next kept me still. I waited a few minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate the man was still nearby. When I finally had the courage to peek, he was gone, leaving only the young boy's body on the ground. My first reaction was to flee. I wanted to run as fast as I could and forget what I had seen. But something inside me wouldn't let me go. There was a feeling of obligation, that I needed to do something, even if it was just to tell someone. With my heart still pounding, I left the alley and headed to a police station. On the way, the image of the boy falling to the ground replayed in my mind. I arrived at the station, soaked and trembling, and reported what I had seen. The officers listened to me with skepticism at first, but they soon realized I was telling the truth. They went to the scene and found the body exactly as I had described. I returned to my shelter, but the fear and the image of that murder would not leave me. I felt like the man could be anywhere, that at any moment he could appear to silence the only witness. I tried to sleep, but nightmares and anxiety kept me awake. I don't know what led that man to kill that boy, but there is no reason in the world for someone to do that. I hope the police can capture the killer. My name is irrelevant. On the streets, a name doesn't mean much. What matters are the stories we carry, the secrets we keep. I was once married, had a respectable job as a civil engineer in New York. My life was ordinary, perhaps even prosperous, but the line between comfort and chaos is thin. A car accident, the loss of my wife and son, and a spiral of depression and alcoholism brought me to where I am today, living on the streets of Chicago. There is something dark about the life of a homeless person. You get used to the cold, the hunger, the disdainful looks. But what really corrodes the soul is the loneliness. On the streets, the night is long and full of shadows, some more literal than others. My shelter is under a bridge, a place I share with other unfortunate souls. We try to create a community, a sense of family. But there are things that happen at night that remind us how fragile we are. On that particular night, I went out in search of food scraps and materials to reinforce our shelter against the imminent rain. The alleys and deserted streets of Chicago are not for the faint-hearted. The darkness hides many dangers, some real, others imagined. But the night I am about to recount was not one where the fear was merely a product of imagination. It was real, tangible. It was late, maybe 3 a.m. I was a few blocks from my shelter when I felt I was being followed. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, a consequence of living constantly on alert. But the footsteps behind me did not lessen. On the contrary, they became more persistent, more determined. I quickened my pace, trying not to draw attention, but the presence behind me did the same. I glanced sideways, just enough to see a man, He was dressed in dark clothes, a cap partially hiding his face. He wasn't homeless. The way he walked, the way his eyes followed me, there was something predatory about him. I kept walking, trying to ignore him, but my heart was pounding. I knew I needed to get back to the shelter, where at least there would be other people around. I turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but he kept coming. It was then that I saw him more clearly. In his hand, he held something that chilled me to the bone. The man was holding a syringe. It wasn't an ordinary disposable needle. It was thick, meant for something much more sinister. My survival instinct went into high alert. I quickened my pace even more, almost running now. The street was deserted except for a few lit windows. I didn't know where to run. Panic was taking over. Suddenly, I heard a shout. A lady from one of the windows was warning me, "Watch out! He has a syringe!" Her shout was an alarm, and in desperation, I turned to face the man. He lunged at me fast, the syringe pointed. On impulse, I managed to dodge, and we grappled on the ground. He tried to pin me down, but desperation gave me strength. We shouted, we fought. The sound of our struggle was so loud that within minutes, the lights in the surrounding houses started to turn on. Doors opened, and a few people came out to see what was happening. The presence of the neighbors made the man hesitate. With one last push, I managed to free myself, and he backed off, looking around. He realized he was surrounded by witnesses, and, with no other option, fled into the darkness. I lay on the ground, panting, trying to process what had just happened. Some people approached, asking if I was okay. The lady from the window came down to me, concerned. Her act of bravery may have saved me. I thanked her, but I knew that night would be forever marked. It wasn't just the physical attack that scared me, but the intent behind it. Who was that man? And why did he want to inject me with something? In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the incident from my mind. Life on the streets continued, but I was more alert, more suspicious. I talked to Bill and other homeless colleagues about the attack. Some said they had heard rumors of people disappearing, of strange figures at night. But no one knew for sure who or what was behind it. I decided to investigate on my own. During the day, I went to the public library and researched news about disappearances and attacks in the area. I discovered that in recent months, there had been several reports of homeless people being attacked, many found dead with injection marks. The police seemed uninterested in investigating, treating the cases as overdoses or fights among homeless people. My mind was swirling with theories. Perhaps it was someone experimenting with drugs on vulnerable people. Or worse, a serial killer. The lack of answers made me increasingly uneasy. I continued to investigate, asking discreetly on the streets, trying to piece together the puzzle. But I had few resources and couldn't come up with anything concrete. To this day, I wonder who that crazy man was. Thank God nothing happened to me.